joining me today. I'd like to show you my go-to chocolate recipe because it's just so dark and rich and it's just really, really tasty. What I'm going to use today, we actually have a hard cocoa that we offer. These are both alkalized cocoa powders, and if you're not familiar with that, it basically just takes the bitterness out of it. And we have a Jersey cocoa, which is a little bit lighter, and then we have a dark cocoa, which is obviously a little bit darker. The Jersey cocoa is lightly alkalized, which means just some of that bitterness is taken out. And the medium nature of the cocoa itself is going to lend to its richness. The dark cocoa is heavily alkalized, which means a lot of that bitterness is taken out. The darker chocolates do tend to be a little bit more bitter on their own, so having it heavily alkalized really makes it a lot more palatable. Now in this recipe that I'm using today, I'm actually using half and half of those. I don't want it so dark that it's not palatable. This also has a little bit of a sweeter fattiness to it that's really tasty in the cake as well. So if you go to www.sweetwise.com, at the top of the bar you're going to see the recipes link. Just click on that and then you're going to see all the recipes pop up. You'll be able to find the ultimate chocolate cake recipe there, as well as the chart for how much batter do I put in my pan. One thing that I also want to point out while you're there on the recipe page is that I have something that I put in the recipe section, but it's really just how much batter do I put in my cake pans. And it has a chart there for different sizes and shapes of cake pans, round, squares, whatever, and how many cups of batter you're going to need for each size of those pans. So for instance, today I'm going to use 6-inch round pans, and I know from looking at my chart that I'm going to need 2 cups of batter in each pan. So looking at my ultimate chocolate cake recipe, I always put my yield in cups of batter instead of saying, oh, this makes 2 9-inch round pans, because whoever makes always a 9-inch round pan? We as cake decorators might have a 4-inch square pan, a 10-inch round pan, etc., etc. So you can go in and find out from that chart how many total cups of batter you're going to need for your entire wedding cake, and then go over to the recipe and figure out how many times you need to make that to complete that entire wedding cake. It helps in your shopping list, it helps in your cost for the whole cake, and then it also just helps you not mix too much batter at one time, how many times you can fit your pans in your oven, that sort of thing. So I know that for my 2 6-inch round pans, I'm going to need a total of 4 cups of batter, and my ultimate chocolate cake recipe makes 10.5 cups of batter. So just so I'm not breaking up eggs, which you can do, it's just a little bit more difficult to scramble out eggs and figure out by the ounces how many you're going to use. It's easier to do it by even numbers of eggs. The whole recipe calls for 4 eggs and 10.5 cups of batter. I'm going to go to about half that, which will be a little over 5 cups of batter. I'll have a little bit extra, but it allows me to use 2 whole eggs and then just stop there. So let's go ahead and put this thing together. So again, working with a half recipe, what I've got here is 2 cups of granulated sugar. I'm going to go ahead and put on all my dry ingredients together. This is a little bit different than a regular recipe where we cream butter and sugar together. So I have 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, and I'm just going to dump that right in there with the sugar. And then I'm going to grab my cocoa powders, which we already talked about. This is, again, a half recipe is going to be 3/8 of a cup of each of these cocoa powders. All right, that's my Jersey cocoa, and now my dark cocoa. And this is going to make it nice and rich and beautiful. Okay. Now the last of the dry ingredients. This is a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon and a half of baking powder, and a teaspoon and a half of baking soda. Going to go right in there. And I'm just going to really quick, just on a low speed, let this go around once just to combine these. All right, good enough. Now I'm going to start adding my wet ingredients. Now in all of my recipes that I'm making cake with, that I always talk about having warm ingredients. So I'm putting milk in here, a vegetable oil in here, eggs in here. I want these warm. So this I can put in the microwave, the milk and the oil, I can put that in the microwave really easily just to warm it up. And the eggs, what I like to do is I leave them in the shell and put warm water over them and then just bring them up to a warm temperature without cooking them. What that does is it helps you bake your cake evenly. Because the cake is warm, it's not setting to the pan right away. You don't have a cold batter. Having a warm batter makes it rise much more evenly and avoids having that hump in the middle. So now I'm going to just start adding these, my warm milk, and this is 1 cup because it's a half recipe. Just go ahead and pour that right in. And then I have a teaspoon and a half of vanilla. Didn't bother to warm that. You don't want it to lose its flavor. Just throw that in there. And I have my half cup of vegetable oil. That's going to go right in. And we'll let this spin a couple times before I add the eggs and the water in here. So now that's combined, I'm just going to go ahead and add my eggs. And at this point, I just want to stop and scrape the sides down, make sure everything's getting incorporated. Scrape all the way down to the bottom just with a rubber spatula. And then we'll let that go around one more time. And now we're going to add our last ingredient. This is 1 cup of boiling water. Now, this might look like a great batter as it is. It's actually going to be a little bit thick and too dense. The 1 cup of water, on the other hand, is going to make this actually look really thin. It kind of freaks a lot of people out the first time they make it. It's like, ooh, is this right? It seems so thin. But I promise, it bakes up to this texture just perfectly, and you're really going to love it. Most important thing is just making sure that once you've got all of that water in there, that you scrape the bottom again and make sure everything's incorporated before you pour it into your pans. So I'm not going to just dump all this in. It's going to have trouble taking it in. I'm just going to turn my mixer on and just kind of slowly drizzle it in. If you add this too quickly, it gets so thin that if your mixer's up a little bit too high, it can really easily splash out, and you don't want that to happen. You'll lose some of your batter. So once you've got all of that water poured in there, you're going to turn your mixer back off, scrape the sides down again, make sure that see how it's thicker on the end of my spatula? Scrape it down one more time. It's thicker down there. You want to make sure that you get all of that incorporated. See how it looks too thin, almost like you've messed up, but I promise you haven't. This is going to be a great batter. You just want to make sure that all of this is incorporated. Okay, all of it's scraped down. Now let's let it spin one more time, and we're ready to go. So I've got my batter all prepared, and I went ahead and got my 2 6-inch pans ready. These are just prepared with a little bit of vegetable shortening and all-purpose flour. Just make sure you get those corners real well, just so it doesn't stick. And then one more time I'm going to scrape to make sure this is going to come out well. And again, look how thin this is. I promise it's not messed up. Makes a really great cake. I always like to go to about 2/3 full. I really like for my cake batter to rise above the top lip of the pan. And I use that top lip of the pan once it's baked to kind of level it. That way I know all of my cakes are exactly the same height. So if you take a look at how deep and rich this cake is, I really, really love this cake. Everybody seems to have a great reaction to it. It's not like a medium chocolate cake, it's a rich chocolate cake. So if you look on the SweetWise website, again, it's the ultimate chocolate cake recipe. Give it a try. I think you're really going to love it. It's going to be your go-to recipe.